Hey everyone, Dr. Tom Moorcroft back here with you for this episode of the Healing from Lyme Disease Summit. And today we have this really special guest, a really great treat for you, a gentleman by the name of Alex Howard, who is someone who I've seen in the background, kind of like coming in and out of my life here and there, but I never really got a chance to get to know him all that well. And he reached out to be part of this because a lot of what we talk about in Healing from Lyme Disease is how do we reset your nervous system so you can actually get to deep healing? And he reached out and he said, hey, I want to talk about this. And I was like, wait, that was like a title I would make for you guys to really get the most important information out there. And Alex has done so many different things. He has a conscious life platform, a reset program that we're going to talk about in terms of how to really put all this stuff into action. But rather than talk about all the accolades, we started to have this conversation off camera that was just so great that we're like, hold on, we got to start and get going right away. So Alex, thanks so much for reaching out. And I can't wait to have this conversation and share with our audience.
Thank you, Tom, for having me. I'm excited to get into it together.
Yeah. So one of the things that I always like to share, I share with everyone, hey, this was my healing journey. This is why I got into this whole thing. And I think when people talk, a lot of people come into my office and they go, do you really know what I'm talking about? Have you experienced this before? I'm like, well, yeah, actually I was sick for 13 years and the same thing you have, I got over. So I always think it's important to understand where someone comes from and what their backstory is so that you know why they're so passionate about the topic that we're going to talk about, that resetting your nervous system for deep healing. So maybe you can share a little bit about where you come from and like how you got to this point to doing all these amazing things in the world that are really changing people's lives.
Yeah, well, thank you, Tom. So sounds like with your experience, I didn't start my kind of career life out, my mid-teens at meeting with a career advisor going, yes, I think I'm going to become an expert in fatigue and trauma and kind of complex chronic illness. I found myself on this path because, like you, I had my own lived experience, which for me was ME, chronic fatigue syndrome, from my mid-teens to my early 20s. And like I think a lot of people go on these healing journeys, part of what was so challenging is it wasn't one thing. There were lots of different pieces to that jigsaw. And one of the hardest things initially was just the recognition that perhaps there was something that I could do that would change the situation. And just briefly speaking to that, I'd been ill for a couple of years and I'd been pretty much housebound and at times fairly bedbound. Symptoms primarily of severe fatigue, muscle pains, dizziness, headache, completely crippling, exhausted the whole time, but then often unable to sleep at night. I didn't have Lyme or co-infections, but very, very obviously similar in terms of the lived experience of symptoms. And after a couple of years of this, it wasn't that I was actively planning on ending my life, but I really was pretty optimistic about continuing living in the way that things were. And I ended up having a conversation with my uncle, who was on those kind of conversations where you look back and you realize that your whole life changed in a conversation, but at the time it was just it was another chat. But the heart of it was that he helped me. I was completely desperate. I hate my life. I can't live like this. I can't go on anymore. And he helped me realize that if I wanted the circumstances of my life to be different, I was going to have to do something different to change them. And with nothing really to fuel me apart from desperation and the naive hope of being a teenager, I ended up setting off on what was then a 5-year journey from that point. And along the way, one of my great frustrations was a couple of things. Firstly, the claim that what was a very real physical condition was psychological in nature. It's that classic arrogance of mainstream medicine of, we don't know what's wrong with you, therefore there is nothing wrong with you. Or we don't know how you can get better, therefore no one knows how you can get better. And so the conclusion is it must be in your head and it's not real. And so that was apart from just being really hurtful and frustrating, it also was very isolating, because just the places you want to go for emotional support are not particularly supportive, because the assumption is that there's something untoward going on in terms of what's happening. But also then the second thing that was incredibly frustrating was, after a while of seeing many different practitioners, I think I saw 35 different doctors and nutritionists and naturopaths in the years that I was ill, then after a while, I'd go and see someone and I'd be somewhat pessimistic about the likelihood of it having a positive outcome, to which people would go, see, that's why you're not getting better, because you don't believe it's going to happen. I'd be like, well, I've invested so much hope so many times that the devastating disappointment something doesn't work is it's so traumatic in of itself, that I kind of go in a bit more measured and a bit more kind of level-headed around things. But there were things along the way that started, we'll get into more of this, but things that started to make a difference. It wasn't any one thing. In fact, my most recent book was called Decode Your Fatigue, because in my eyes, a diagnosis of ME, chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, or whatever that may be, is not a diagnosis. It's a label for a set of symptoms. And with Lyme and co-infections, although you have more clarity of what's happening physiologically, part of the reason why summits like this I think are so important is they're still complex jigsaws of all these different pieces that need to be understood and that come together. So there was no one answer, at least in my journey, but there were many answers. There were different pieces to the jigsaw that I'm sure, like you did, Tom, on your healing journey, you learned to piece it together and to figure out how to map that path forward. And then just briefly on the other side of that, I ended up setting up the clinic that I wanted to exist in the years that I'd been ill, a clinic that was integrative in its nature, a clinic that put the patient at the heart of everything, the recognition that community and support of other people on the journey is also part of that healing jigsaw. And in the nearly 20 years since then, the Optimum Health Clinic now, we've worked with well over 10,000. I mean, it's 10,000 since we put the new computer system in place sort of kind of 10 years ago, and we've been going nearly 20 years. So patients in 50 countries, a team of 20 full-time practitioners specializing in fatigue-related conditions. And I can say at this point, there's good news and bad news. The good news is there's many paths to recovery. And the bad news is there's many paths to recovery. So hopefully what we can do is start to make a bit of sense of some of that together.
Yeah, I just think it's so inspiring to hear that there are other reasons that people have brain fog and fatigue and joint pain that aren't just tick-borne infections. And I actually got diagnosed with ME/CSF, fibromyalgia, after they told me it was all in my head. And it turned out to be Lyme disease, Babesia, and heavy metals. But the part that I love about everything that I've seen, all of your work, is the empowerment of the person to figure out that jigsaw puzzle for themselves, how to decode it and to understand, like you're saying, like, I think so many people feel isolated, man. And that's actually if we have a chance to talk about polyvagal theory, one of the ways to get sicker is to get more isolated. So it's like the system is actually perpetuating your illness. But understanding that you and I and so many other people have been through this isolating piece, and it's just a part of the journey, and we can have, and then we can reclaim our own strength and our own pieces. And that's what I love about everything I've heard. It's like all your work is about really empowering the person. And that's really what the purpose of our summit is to not say that like everybody's code is going to be different. Like just because you say Lyme and Bartonella doesn't mean that, oh, now I'm going to slap a protocol on you. In fact, that's a great way to not get better quickly and to get more isolated, but to compare yourself to others. So within all of this, where we're kind of going through, we're trying to not be so isolated. We're trying to understand that like we're similar to other people, which is nice, but we're also unique. How does this what is the key? I mean, I hear you talk a lot about the stress response and maybe whether it's a proper stress response or maybe a little bit different. So, but like, what's the key here? Like, where do we start?
Yeah. So the first thing I want to say before we come into this in more detail is that this is, for some people, it's the jigsaw, like it's the piece which changes everything. For other people, it's a piece of the jigsaw. For other people, it's the piece of the jigsaw which unlocks the other pieces in the jigsaw. And maybe for some people, they're not into jigsaws at all, and it's not nothing to do with that. But I want to be clear that, to make this accessible, we need to talk in somewhat simplified terms. I don't want for a second people to think that I think these are simple conditions. There's lots of different pieces in those jigsaws, and it's important to understand that. So let's put it down to this. Ultimately, our body has two states that it can be in. It can be in a state of stress, or it can be in a state of healing. State of stress, you mentioned Stephen Porges's work on polyvagal theory. So we could say that our body is in a state of fight or flight. So it's in an activated state, or it's in a state of freeze, like a state of shutdown. That fight or flight has become so significant, there's like a numbing and a shutting down that then starts to happen. So why would it go into a stress response? Well, that's a incredibly well developed and designed system over kind of, hundreds of thousands, millions of years, however long human beings have been kind of developing their nervous systems on planet Earth, that when there is danger or threat in the environment, our body responds. That's a really good thing. It responds by releasing certain stress hormones, adrenaline, cortisol. Our blood flow goes from our digestive system to our arms and our legs, because if we need to flight, to run really, really fast, we need to fight. We need that immediate access to that energy to respond. That wonderful gourmet lunch that we had is really unimportant to digest, because we need to survive what's happening in the next 20 seconds of the threat that's happening. Like, imagine you and I are walking down the street together, and we don't see the massive, truck that's thundering towards us. We need to respond really quickly. Going back thousands of years, that might have been the saber-toothed tiger that's chasing us, but we need to have that immediate response. So that is a necessary for survival, healthy stress response. There are times that we use that in a very deliberate, positive way. We go to the gym and we physically train our body. We stress our body. It then builds a response and a tolerance and a capacity to that stress. We grow muscle. The reason why we talk about muscle being ripped, we basically rip the muscle and it repairs stronger than before. The problem is when we move from acute stress to chronic stress. So rather than that being a temporary trigger to our system and a healthy response, that stress response becomes maladaptive, or it's a chronic ongoing threat. Now, there's lots of different examples of this. One example may be that we grew up in a childhood environment where our core emotional needs were not being met. And just take a slight tangent for a moment. Our three core emotional needs are boundaries, the ability to say no or to say yes; safety, the capacity to, as a child, have our nervous system co-regulate with our caregivers and then learn to self-regulate our nervous system as we grow up; and the need for love. Now, if those needs are met, that's great. If they're not met, then our nervous system starts to activate to try and build safety when there's the absence of those emotional needs. So it may be that from a young age, we learned to have an activated nervous system to try and buffer the sense of the world not being safe because those emotional needs are not being met. Secondly, it may be in the years up to getting sick, there were constant pressures and stresses in our lives. Maybe the stress of divorce, or the stress of financial stress, or relational stress, whatever it may be, that we normalized to a higher level of stress than is healthy. One of the great capacities of the human body is we can normalize to almost anything, but the more we normalize to it, the more we don't recognize that actually something is out of balance. But particularly what I want to speak to in the context of this conversation as well is suffering from either a medically unexplained illness, or indeed a complex chronic illness where you understand that you have a tick-borne infection which is having impacts in your body, but what to do about it, how to do it, will it work, will you recover, should you push through, should you rest more, what are the implications of this treatment option? All of that becomes a constant trigger and stress to our nervous system. And so that healthy stress response that's designed for sudden acute danger and stress becomes maladaptive. And we normalize to being in this maladaptive stress response. This then has all kinds of impacts to our physical body, to our emotional body, to our relationships. Just one example I'll give, because I think it's one that pulls together a few pieces we're talking about here. Dr. Robert Navio's work on cell danger response. And so your mitochondria, which effectively are the powerhouses of your cells, or like the power stations of your cells, their job is to manufacture and to make energy, that they have a second function. So in addition to making energy, they're also responsible for danger signaling. So when there's a threat, either an internal threat or an external threat in the environment, that danger needs to be communicated through your system, and it's your mitochondria that ultimately do that. So when we're under threat, whether it's a real threat or it's a perceived threat, by the way, doesn't really make a difference. That's why you can wake up from a really vivid nightmare and your heart is racing and you're sweating, and it's literally like you've been escaping the threat. That whether it's real or imagined, your mitochondria are deprioritizing energy production to prioritize danger signaling, which means that there's a vicious circle, because the more we're in a maladaptive stress response, the less energy we're making, but the less energy we're making, the less resilient we are to meet the events that are happening. Therefore, the more of a stress they become in the first place. And so there are childhood factors, which may mean that we've learned to normalize to a maladaptive stress response. There are life events that can happen. But even if we had none of that, even if all that happened was we got bitten by a tick and we've developed chronic Lyme disease, even that alone is a major trigger to a dysregulated nervous system, which ultimately then means our body is in the exact opposite state to what it needs to be able to heal. So yeah, that just gives a little bit of context around it.
You know, I think, Alex, it's a really interesting point. And one of the things I really want to highlight that you mentioned is it's almost like you get into a comfort zone. Like your body gets comfortable and used to this maladaptive state because it's kind of your comfort zone. This is where you've been. And from a primitive reptilian perspective, our ancient nervous system actually feels safe with the status quo. And so one of the things that I'm curious what you've seen, because in my patients, I've seen when I ask them to change, they're all gung-ho to change. When I get them on a new protocol, they can't wait till they have the flare that signals that it's working, and then it's going to get better. But then something crazy happens, like they actually get better. And then like about a week or two into getting better, more like 10 days, all of a sudden the shit hits the fan. It's like people freak out. And I kind of get this sense that it's like almost like we've changed their nervous system from a crappy, like not really all that safe state, but a comfortable state, to a new state that's now uncomfortable because you don't even recognize what health feels like. And it's scary. And I feel like there's this, not like someone's done it purposefully, like the doctor who told them it was all in their head and they didn't want to check deeper to find the root cause, but meaning like their nervous system feels the shift and then it goes, I want to go back to comfortable, even though comfortable is not actually all that safe, because who would say having chronic Lyme is safe, right? But it's your comfort zone. So when you change it, so I mean, is this something you're seeing, that if people do get a big change, like their nervous system is almost pre-programmed to pull them back? And if you do, I mean, what do we do with it? Like, how do we get over that?
So that can definitely be a factor in what can happen, that it's like they are effectively not sustaining the shift in their nervous system, and it's pulling back to homeostasis. I think there's also some other pieces here as well, because the heart of this question is what causes relapse. And so one of the things that often also happens is that someone is able to, they get more energy, and then all the stuff they couldn't do before because they didn't have energy suddenly starts to get done. And so it's one of the biggest causes of relapse that I see is a boom and bust pattern. And so what's behind that? Going back to, again, childhood trauma and the relationship with this maladaptive stress response, it's like maybe we learn as a child that our safety was tied to helping and supporting everyone else. And maybe we learn that our love was tied to what we achieved. Maybe we learned that if we weren't in control of ourselves and what was happening in the environment, that we weren't safe. So we live our life in a way that potentially is completely unsustainable, because we're constantly trying to help everyone else, ignoring our own needs. We're constantly pushing through, trying to achieve to win love, and we're trying to control everything that's happening around us. And so these are really unsustainable ways of living, and they can be factors in why someone's system gets depleted to the point that maybe, that day that you got bitten by a tick, 5 other people got bitten by a tick, but not everyone developed chronic Lyme disease. So why is that? Well, it's down to the resilience of the system. What defines the resilience? Partly, yes, it's genetics, but partly it's also all these different lifestyle factors in terms of how we've taken care of and what's happening in our body. And so then someone crashes and no longer can they do the achieving and got the energy to do it in the first place. They've had to put all these really rigid boundaries in place with everyone around them. They can't do the helper pattern because there's not enough energy to do anything for anyone. And they sort of relinquish control because they're just trying to get through the day. And then they do a protocol, and maybe they go through a difficult time with the protocol, and then it starts to work. And energy starts then to come back. But now you got a problem, because those underlying patterns haven't necessarily, unless you've worked on them, haven't necessarily been resolved. The difference was before you had no energy to fuel the patterns. Now you got the energy, it's harder to say no to everyone else, because they're like, well, hang on, like you're going out and doing this and doing that, and you're saying you can't come and help me with this thing. Or it's like your boss at work says, well, you're back working, I need you to hit this deadline. And then suddenly you feel like they'll won't care about you or love you, or they'll fire you if you don't do that thing. And so this is where, in my eyes, we have to really see the complexity of both the picture of how someone gets sick in the first place, but also the different factors in recovery. And if you heal one piece without addressing the other piece, you can end up recreating a different version of the same situation. And so when we see relapse or crashes or mini crashes as really important information. Like what, and I know it's the kind of place from which you're asking this question. I'm sure it's the same question you're asking in your own mind as you're kind of working with your patients. It's like, what's actually gone on here? Because something's worked and that's great, but something else has gone out of balance. And what is that?
I love it, because I'm always looking like, I almost don't like when nothing happens, but if people get better or they get worse, there's so much information in there. And granted, there's information in not getting better too, but I mean, I love when you get a crack in the egg and you start to see it peek through, like I just had a guy the other day, actually, I had to phone a friend, believe it or not. Like I had put him on, he'd done all these things. He's done his mold treatment, his Lyme treatment. We found that his testosterone was in the toilet, and it was like super low. But what was really interesting is we bumped that level up, and the dude felt so bad. He felt so much worse. And most guys, if they have low, you bump them up, they feel great. And I was like, phoned a friend who's a urologist and specializes in this even more so than I do. And I'm like, I have a theory, but I want to know, before I tell you my theory, I want to know what it is. And he was just like, most guys feel better. And I go, well, what I think is he actually got like you just said, he got the energy to do the other things, and all of his Lyme treatments and his mold detoxification protocol just worked so much better when he actually had the energy to do it.
It reminds me of a funny kind of, some of these case studies become like a bit mythological in the history of your kind of clinical work, right? So I remember years and years and years ago, funny enough, one of our first ever employee, must have been back in like 2004, I think it was an early patient of the clinic. And he got a job because he was doing a workshop, and he was like, no one's ever going to give me a job when I can't work full time. I was like, I'll give you a job. So he ended up working for us. And he made some really good progress. And then one day he was because he worked for me, it wasn't appropriate for me to be his practitioner, he was working with one of the people in the team. And he comes in and he said, how are you doing? He goes, oh, terrible. I'm the worst I've been ever. It's just horrendous. And of course their heart's thinking, oh my God, like, well, what's happened? So well, what have you been up to the last few weeks? And he goes, oh, well, last weekend I climbed Snowdon, which is the highest mountain one of the highest mountains in the UK, if not the highest. I remember my geography. And he goes, yeah, I climbed it. And then I went out for, I kind of partied afterwards, and now I just feel dreadful. It's like, hang on a second. You come from like the fact that you can't even function in day-to-day life to climbing the biggest mountain. And you've had a crash, you've done too much, But the fact you even thought you could do that in the first place, like, let's have a look at what's happened there. But it was funny. I was chuckling to myself as you were talking, because exactly what you said is so true. The practitioners' hearts sink if people are kind of look behind the curtain. Our hearts sink when nothing's happening. When things get worse or things get better, we've got information and we can understand why. It's when, you know, you work with someone and month after month you do different things and just it feels like nothing changes. What I've come to realize, by the way, is often that's some sort of trauma shutdown response. So there's a kind of numbing and freeze in the system, and it's a defense against everything. But yeah, everything's information, and sometimes the secret to the next big breakthrough is what was behind the crash that we're trying to understand and work through.
Right. And I think one of the things, Alex, that's so critical about what you're saying is it might not happen in the first 2 weeks or the first 2 months. And I mean, people are like, oh, I've seen like 8 other doctors. I've been waiting to see you. I'm like, all right, great. And then like 3 weeks later, they expect like I've got some holy water that they're going to drink and they're going to be magically cured. And I'm like I'd be really happy to share that with you if I had it. But it's more like that puzzle of learning the things. And like, I'm not saying that every guy with chronic Lyme disease needs testosterone, but what I'm saying is life happens around people who have chronic illness, and some of your chronic illness leads to some of these other things. And it's like you've been saying, like decoding and figuring out what puzzle piece is appropriate for a particular person, I think is really important. And one of the things I'd love to sort of riff on for a minute is because you talk so much about the science of how trauma affects your body and that maladaptive stress response. One of the things is I feel like in our field, there's some accidental and maybe sometimes purposeful medical betrayal and trauma just because your doctor doesn't know and they're in a system that's like you highlighted. If I don't know, it's something's wrong with the patient, not that I should just look deeper. But then there's this other thing, and I don't know how you've seen it in your experience, but I find that people compare themselves, their protocol, their progress, their lack of progress to other people all the time. And the thing that breaks my heart personally is there's so much social media where a lot of the progress is people are like, oh, I got a great day. And they make it sound like they're cured, and then they crash the next day, but no one talks about that. And it's like, so it's either doom and gloom or if you're not doing what I'm doing, you and your practitioner suck and you should change everything. But that's not very individual. That's me comparing myself to somebody else. I mean, what's your experience been kind of in that? Do patients and how do patients get over this comparing themselves to other people? Because I think it holds them back.
You know, a good recovery is like good politics. Boring. It's like there's like, as soon as you go to the extremes, you got a problem, right? It's like the extremes of the left and the extremes of the right make for good social media headlines, and they make for good debate. And the more people argue, the more things drive up in algorithms and everything else. But the truth of a lot of political, I don't want to go down a political rabbit hole, but the truth of a lot of political things is they're really complex, and there's lots of different competing forces and pieces. And almost by definition of throwing out simple solutions, it shows someone doesn't understand what's going on. And a good recovery is boring because it's gradual and it's stable and it's solid. The last thing you want is your recovery to be like a cryptocurrency, which is shooting up one day and crashing the next day. You want it to be like a really boring old stock that just gradually goes up, but in a way that has substance and is solid. I genuinely get nervous when people's recoveries go too fast. And I know that there are people in our industry that as soon as they've got miracle recoveries, they grab a testimonial, throw it out on the internet and pretend that's what's happening for everyone. And I think it's really problematic for the reason that you spoke to, which is that everyone then starts comparing themselves and they feel like they're failing and it's their fault that they're not like that person that's this kind of poster child of the miracle recovery. But what you want is a recovery which is built on genuine diagnostic and understanding of what's happening, genuine effective pathway to intervention, and you can see how that recovery is happening, and you're being methodical and you're working with those different pieces along the way, because then you don't have to live with this constant anxiety of being ill or crashing or feeling like your recovery is built on quicksand, suddenly going to fall apart, that you've genuinely dealt with what's going on. And it's like, I liken it to I've sort of joked that I'm a sort of therapist by day and jobbing entrepreneur by night, in the sense that building an effective business around the work that we do is just a lot of slog and patience and hard work and doing things properly and doing things thoroughly and not trying to do things too quickly in ways where you're cutting corners. But I also want to go back to something that you said a minute ago. I think it's a really good way to make an important point here, which is that these different pieces of the jigsaw are also all interconnected. So you made the point around low testosterone, that I find myself a man of a certain age where these things require a certain investigation. And it's like low testosterone in men is really interesting, because it's some of the research that we've been looking at recently around and I'm going to slightly butcher the details here, but the fundamentals of the point are valid. That some really interesting research around the relationship between testosterone and, for example, digestive issues. So the research seems to show something along the lines of that women have almost, I think it was double the incidence of irritable bowel syndrome than men. And some of the thinking around this may be that male sex hormones have a buffering impact against things like small intestinal bacterial overgrowth and IBS and so on. So it's a bit of one of those chicken and egg situations. Is it that people have digestive issues, which means they've got poor absorption, which means they're not taking the raw ingredients to make hormones? Or is it that low hormones is impacting upon digestion, which is then becomes one of these vicious circles? And so you can have someone, for example, that has Lyme, and maybe the pathway goes like this. They have Lyme, they're doing an bacterial protocol, which is really effective. It may be for that person in terms of the Lyme pathway, but it's trashing their digestive system. And because it's trashing their digestive system, now their hormones are going out of balance. And so like understanding how all of these different pieces are interconnected is also really important. And you can have one person can do a particular thing and it's like the miracle for them, but someone else, the thing that helped them is the problem. Or it may be the breakthrough at one stage, the thing that really helps us go a certain step becomes the limitation at the next stage. And so a big focus of my clinical work in more recent years has been, yes, of course, understanding these different pieces, but also the sequencing of how you do intervention and the recognition that sometimes the order which you do things is almost more important than the actual things that you're doing in the first place.
Yep. So it's crazy. Like I just remember, it is so, when I learned that, it's not just knowing what to do, but what order to do it in. And that protocols are things that allow us to have a better understanding of what the possibilities are, but then we apply them to a unique human being and create their plan. That includes like changing a protocol based upon how the body responds to it. I just think is so critical to understand. And like this, I love the way you just summarize, kind of like not compare, when you compare your protocol to other people, it's problematic. And so, or it can be, and usually is.
I also think, sorry if I didn't try to interrupt you, Tom, just one more point about that as well, which is that I also think we have a responsibility as clinicians around the stories that we put out there, right? Like, I don't want to kind of get overly hard about it, but
please do. I'm on the exact same page as you.
Yeah, I just think
we have to have a greater responsibility as healing professionals to stop talking bullshit, because our patients know it, people know it, and you're preying on people who are suffering and are vulnerable because they want to heal. Stop. There is enough suffering. There's enough patients to go around. There's enough people that we could treat them like a wonderful, unique human being, and please treat them the way you would treat your own family. And if you want to sell snake oil to your own family, maybe you want to think about that again. So feel free to dive right in.
I mean, you said
it's one of my pet peeves. It's just like,
yeah, it's like, we put out recovery stories for many years. We had a back in the days, you do conference calls. We started in 2007. Every other week, I'd interview someone that had a fatigue-related condition and either fully recovered or made some meaningful steps along that pathway. And I was very deliberate to partly pick the complex stories, because the quick stories don't last 45 minutes in terms of an interview. It's like, I did this thing and it was a kind of a happily ever after. But people would sometimes say to me, and we still put them out on the Optimal Health Clinic YouTube channel these days as well, say, oh, well, I saw this other clinic and they said everyone's getting better at doing this one thing. And you're talking about people taking sometimes 2-3 years, and that, not everyone gets better with your approach. And I'm like, well, that's the truth of the reality. But I think it's for the very reason that you raised. It's like putting out the miracle stories that we all get is a little bit like putting on, the Instagramification of someone's life, which is a perfect photo in a perfect moment, which often has a whole other story and reality that's behind it. And I'm always the first to say, I don't have all the answers. Everyone that we work with the Optimal Health Clinic doesn't make a full recovery. There's a small minority that don't make much progress. We learn the most from them, as much as that can be frustrating. But the other truth is that lots of people make meaningful progress, and it takes time and it takes patience in that process. And that, in a sense, go back to one of the things I said when you asked me about my own story, that my perceived negativity towards trying new treatments was an intelligent self-protective response to protect me from that sense of disappointment. So if people are watching this, which are skeptical and suspicious of new pathways, good, like, protect yourself. Don't let it become crippling to the point that you don't try anything new, or that your cynicism gets in the way of taking positive action. But do that due diligence and be willing to ask those challenging questions. And that's your intelligence being there. That's not having a bad attitude and not wanting to get better.
It's so well said. And I mean, I think it's like, I just remember, like, in my healing journey, my back was against the wall. It had been 6 years. Every medicine I listened to, everybody, didn't work. None of it worked. And so I was standing there staring at the wall, which is kind of funny because when I first got sick, my boss found me staring at a computer screen, drooling on myself. So we kind of figured something was wrong. But, Alex, it was interesting. I remember thinking, like, I can keep going down this path and I know what I'm going to get because I've had that for 6 years. But I had this other vision of what I wanted my life to look like. And the second I gave myself permission to open that and bring that into my life, somebody handed me a yoga DVD, which for me happened to be the piece of the puzzle I needed next. But I did this like a beast, literally. And in the beginning, a beast was not much. I mean, it was kind of more like a chinchilla or a small, chihuahua, although, and then I progressively got more and more in tune with all this, but it took at least 6 months before I noticed anything. And then I did this stuff in intensive dietary change, listening to my body, because the yoga was kind of making me not like crappy food. And I was listening to my body, but it took 2 years. And I was like, but I was 70%, 75% better. But what's crazy is I was doing, and people think I'm nuts, but I was doing, once I got through the initial phases, I was doing an hour and a half of yoga once a day, 6 days a week, taking off the new moon and the full moon, because those were the rules, so that you respected the poles of gravity on the water in your body. You got a little more in tune, and you took a day off so you weren't attached to the protocol. And what was really interesting was I learned so much, but it wasn't all easy. And then I still needed another 4.5 years of medical treatment after I got 70% better to be 100% better for over 12 years now. And I just think the way you summarize it is so critical for people to understand. You don't necessarily, it's a journey, and your journey may be super fast or super slow. So one of the things that I like to highlight, and I just like to kind of sometimes put a big highlighter and exclamation point around these points that are so critical. The other part, though, is I want to get into how we reset our nervous system, because I think that this is the empowerment part. And in Lyme disease, one of the reasons that people with Lyme disease have a hard time getting better, I know in the beginning we talked about, hey, maybe you're just comfortable there, and that's your nervous system trying to protect you and doing a great job. But the other part is the areas of your brain that allow you to recognize safety are also areas of the brain that we know Lyme disease negatively impacts. But I'd like to tell people that, hey, just because Lyme is negatively impacting this, you have another avenue into changing those areas of your brain so that there's less negative effect of Lyme. So in your system, like, how do we actually go about sort of resetting the nervous system so we get not only the physical healing that we're looking for, but that emotional healing that actually allows all this to gel and become our new reality?
Yeah, great question. So in the reset program, which is my online coaching program, we use the acronym RESET to really look at the 5 key stages of that process. So the first, as part of what we've been talking about in this conversation, is we got to recognize what's happening. That if you can see it, you don't have to be it. If we can recognize that our nervous system is dysregulated, and that maybe there's folks that are watching this that are suddenly starting to make some sense of that, they realize their nervous system is in this activated state, and that maybe that is impacting on the healing capacity. Like we all have, if we cut ourselves, and we might have to stitch the skin together and keep it clean, but the skin will heal. If we break a bone and we set the bone, we might take painkillers to manage the pain, but that bone will heal. We have a natural capacity to heal. The problem is when we're in a maladaptive stress response, our natural capacity to healing is not available because we're trying to just sustain the stress response we're in. So if we can recognize that that's what's happening, we then need to examine, which is the first E of reset, to examine, well, what are these triggers? What's actually happening? What are the thought patterns? What are the ingredients of this maladaptive stress response? We then come to the S of reset, which we've got to stop. The other part of the S is we've got to self-regulate. We've got to move. So if we don't get healthy co-regulation as a child, which many of us didn't, we've got to learn how to self-regulate our nervous system as an adult. That's stopping these patterns. And part of the amazing science of neuroplasticity is that our brain can be rewired. And just because we've learned to think and believe and to feel things in certain ways, that's just what we learned to do. It doesn't mean that we can't ultimately change that. So we recognize, we examine, we stop, we self-regulate, we reset our system. Then the interesting bit comes in, because you asked about emotions, that part of the speeding up of our nervous system is a moving away from all of the emotions, the second E of reset, all of the emotions we've not been feeling. So those impacts of childhood trauma, which are held in our body, we start to calm the system, and then, oh dear, we start to feel that stuff. So we need to have tools to be able to metabolize and to process and to move through those emotions. And then the T of reset is that we have to learn to go back to these core emotional needs, the need of love. If we didn't get those needs met, we have to learn to transform our relationship with ourselves. That often involves working on our inner critic. It involves working on these underlying patterns of the achiever, the helper, the controller, the perfectionist, all these patterns of how we're trying to learn to meet our needs. So we need to recognize what's happening, we need to examine the ingredients underneath that. We need to stop and to self-regulate. We need to do our emotional healing work. And then we need to transform our relationship with ourselves. And a bit like we were talking about with functional medicine interventions, how we sequence those pieces is important. It's very difficult to transform our relationship with ourselves when our nervous system is still dysregulated. We can't really do the emotional healing work until we build enough inner safety to be able to actually hold those emotions. The way we build that inner safety is by learning to self-regulate, learning to calm and to settle the system. And so what we found over the last 20 years of developing this program and these ways of working, having now had over 5,000 people go through this program in the last few years and in its latest iteration, is that the sequencing is important. It's not just understanding the theories and the ideas, because you can understand it all intellectually, but it's actually what we do that's different in our nervous system and how we relate to ourselves, which actually creates the change. And so the application of ourselves to doing those daily practices and those tools and strategies is incredibly important as well.
Love it, man. It's like, it's so good. It's nice and simple. You got the nice acronym, just dialing it in. And like, I find it, it's so critical, whether you're talking about trauma work or emotional work or everything work, especially in Lyme and mold. Like, recovery really does have a lot to do with doing it in the right order, as well as doing the right things. And I think there's so many people out there like, oh, you got to treat the MCAS before you treat the mold, before you treat the Bartonella, before you treat the Lyme. And I'm like, maybe, maybe it's a little different for you. And that's where I think that getting people in front of providers who have successfully done this for themselves and or other people. This is the other thing. Like, so many people in our field, like, I'm just going to another person who put the plaque up that said Lyme or mold on it. I'm like, well, have they had it? Have they gotten better? Do they treat a lot of people that get better? And are they honest, like you've just been, and said, hey, I don't get everybody better, but I get a lot of people better. And when I don't get them better, I'm looking even deeper to find out what I can learn. So,
well, also, if I just want to just jump in on that point, if you don't mind as well, that Lyme's a really interesting one for me, because 10 years ago, nearly 10 years ago, my wife's sister, so my sister-in-law, crashed with what we thought was ME chronic fatigue syndrome. And we kind of joke that she got the deluxe protocol, i.e. she moved into our house and we cared for her. And initially at that point, I would say the Optimum Health Clinic's understanding of Lyme and co-infections was pretty basic. And we did all the obvious stuff that we do with ME/CFS and fatigue patients. And she did make some initial progress, and she kind of stabilized and so on. But she was nowhere near where she needed to be in terms of her actual recovery. And so it was then in time, working with our nutrition team, that recognized that, in the end, figured out that Lyme was at the core of what was happening. And when at that point, she'd been living in my house, my wife's in my house for, I think, 18 months. I was like, think we might need to do some research into Lyme. Think we might, and that was getting on for 10 years ago now. That was a real catalyst for digging much deeper. And as you say, unless we've really had these personal experiences, it's very easy to oversimplify things. It's very easy to think that we understand things when actually we've just got pieces of the genome that she went and made a, she got year, is about to have a baby, and it's doing amazingly well. But it was another reminder to me along the way that we're always learning. And one of the things that I think is exciting in recent years is that, as much as it's a sad way for it to happen, the massive sort of explosion of long COVID patients has meant that there's now more research money, there's more interest that's coming in, and that's also helping bring more awareness and more science to, sometimes it's things that we've known have worked for years, but we haven't always had the science of why they work. That it's exciting to sort of fill in the detail around even those areas as well.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. It's like we're all specializing in certain things, but we always have to keep our blinders open because it might be something else coming in. And I agree, like the pandemic sucks, right? But in one sense, but it's like my illness. It sucked when I had it, but now we're actually putting like ME/CFS, Lyme disease, other chronic hyperreactive immune system illnesses that are really similar to COVID. They've been around a lot longer potentially, and we've known a lot more, but we know how to address COVID more because we know how to address these other things. But we're also starting to see front and center the effects of trauma, the effects of the emotional experience of this pandemic, and how it affects the symptoms. And maybe that'll help us be a little bit more open when we talk about Lyme and mold and all these, or even chronic fatigue for other reasons, because that's really the truth. I mean, it's this multifactorial thing where we take these illnesses that are coming out are actually requiring us to come back to a place where we actually reintegrate into being a full human, body, mind, spirit, and however else you like to define it. But it's not, we're just a body that's missing a pill. It's that we have to take care of that emotional side, the energy side, and figure out what we need uniquely as a person. So I really appreciate the way you kind of frame all of this, Alex. And so I'm sure after this whole conversation, there's going to be a boatload of people who want to learn more about what you're doing, how to sort of, potentially even reset their nervous system through your system. So how do people reach out and get in touch with you if they're interested in learning more about what you're doing?
Yeah, well, thank you. Well, the best place to go is my website, which is just my name, alexhoward.com. And there you'll find You can sign up for a free 3-part video series that goes into the reset framework in much more detail. It goes into cell danger response in more detail and polyvagal theory and so on. So that's a great place to go deeper into what we've been talking about. You'll also find signposts to the Optimum Health Clinic there, to our practitioner team, also to our therapeutic coaching practitioner training program. Also, something I'll highlight, my passion project is really trying to bring more awareness to all of this. And so I have a YouTube series where we film people's therapeutic journeys with me, and then we release an episode each week, and we follow someone for kind of 6 to 10 sessions. And you can just go to YouTube and just search "In Therapy with Alex Howard." And that's a great way to see. It's not so much about the kind of the sciences we've been talking about, but actually in a real therapeutic relationship on working this way. How does that work? And so it's a good way to get an insight into that.
Awesome. I love it because it's like allowing people to see the reality of healing. It's the ability to see how you interact, and it's not necessarily all the studio production stuff where we have the right thing, but it's just like this, just a conversation. So I just want to say thank you so much for reaching out to be a part of this, because this is the core concept this is why we created the summit, is to have these conversations. And what I think people are going to really notice is there are a lot more conversations about what's the right order to do things in, how to be a unique individual and receive the healing that you deserve to receive and not worry about the other person's, and to look at these adverse childhood events, looking at trauma, and I love that you bring up real or perceived. That is so critical, because whether or not your doctor actually slighted you, if your body and your nervous system felt they did, it is real, irregardless of what they thought. I haven't talked about this the whole summit, and I was about to close, but there's this really cool MRI study that I want to share. And if you have anything to say about it, Alex, before we close, I would love to. But just so you guys understand, there was a functional MRI study, right? And they had 3 people in different rooms, and they were playing a remote video game where they were throwing a ball to each other. 3 people back and forth. So, Alex and I are throwing the ball back and forth. And then we've got my wife, Jill, over here. We're throwing the ball to her virtually. And at one point in this study, the researchers said, "Hey, Alex and Jill, don't throw the ball to Tom." So they stopped throwing the ball. And so Alex and Jill are throwing the ball back and forth, but I'm left out. So they do this for a couple minutes, and then they whisk everybody off to the functional MRI scanner. And what they found is that the areas of the brain, including anterior cingulate gyrus and the amygdala, lit up in the person who was left out. So Tom's brain was all like, "Oh my God, I was left out." And I was having a core emotional anger, like left out, sort of betrayed from the group experience that they could see in my brain. And what was really cool about that was Alex and Jill never existed. They were a computer program. So me playing a computer program, if I thought I was slighted, I had the biochemical changes in my brain as if 2 people dissed me. So it's just such a powerful recognition in the scientific research community of what our personal experience is. So stop freaking comparing yourself to other people. Start having that real experience of yourself. And I just think that, because if you think other people are talking shit about you, they did, even if they never did. So stop shitting on yourself.
There's a whole rabbit hole you've opened up at the end here, but I'll just say a couple of things very quickly. So firstly,
we might have to we'll cut to a bonus section here, but this is the key stuff of healing. So have at it, Alex.
So also, we had some really interesting conversations internally recently around particularly the rise of awareness around neurodiversity, and which I think is a really important conversation. There's a big path of people getting adult diagnoses of autism, ADHD, and so on. And I think that's really, it's great, and it impacts my own close family as well. I think it's really helpful. And then what can happen is people have this recognition that they've struggled to kind of integrate, or they've struggled to feel connected in the world for years, and so they now have some vocabulary and some language around that. And we were having a conversation with a student on our practitioner training who was saying, you don't understand what it's like when you feel this way and you feel ostracized and this and that. And I said, I think I don't understand your experience, because your experience is your experience. But I tell you what, growing up in your second half of your teens, your early 20s with a chronic illness where you can't do sport and you love sport, and the currency as a guy in your teenage years is often sport. You can't drink alcohol, and that's the kind of currency of popularity, particularly in England. Like, if you want to fit in, you get drunk basically in your teenage years in England. Like, it's a thing. You know, you can't, having to go and have a nap each afternoon, having to eat different foods for everyone, all of these things. And that experience you described of being the person that's left out is the lived experience of many people with a chronic illness, that they feel left out of society. They feel like this thing's happening over here, but they're not part of it because they can't participate because they haven't got the energy to do it. So the point that you made around that activating the amygdala and activating the stress centers in the nervous system, that alone is a perfect example of simply the cultural misunderstandings around chronic illness and the sense of not being able to participate in society in of itself is triggering the maladaptive stress response that we were talking about. And so if there's nothing else that's happened, there's no childhood trauma, there's no life stressors, there's not even anxiety about symptoms day to day, just that experience in of itself is having an impact on the nervous system.
So true. What a great way to summarize all these things that we're experiencing. And that's the thing with the cultural changes that are going on, race relations, COVID, it's just coming at us from every single direction. So I'm really, I feel so honored, Alex, to be able to have this conversation, to shed some light on this, to help people understand that they do have the power to reset their nervous system. They do have the personal power to take back physical and emotional healing to some degree. And for some people, it might be 5 or 10%. Other people like me, it might be closer to 75 or 100%. But all of these things, I would just suggest, if you got, everyone listening, take all of this information that Alex Howard has just shared with you and start to see where a little bit of it can be integrated into your life, so you can start to see it, like we talked, if you want to get new results, you're going to have to change what you're doing in your day. If you love the results you're currently getting, then keep doing that. But most of us here are here because we want to help you be open to new possibilities of healing. And most people who are watching are here, hey, I myself or a loved one really is ready to heal. And so this information we just talked about today, to me, is some of the most empowering stuff. If it really resonates with you, on our Summit resource page, we're going to have all the links to Alex Howard's website and everything, so that you can go directly there, because it's such a great thing. So Alex Howard, thank you so much for joining us. I know we could do this forever because this is a great conversation, but I just want to say thank you from the bottom of my heart and for all our listeners. So much gratitude for you being here.
Thank you, Tom. I appreciate it. I really enjoyed our conversation. Thank you for having me, and it's a great event. I'm happy to be part of it. Thank you.
And everyone, thank you for joining us for this conversation. This is Alex Howard with Dr. Tom Workcroft, and I really appreciate you joining us for this episode of the Healing from Lyme Disease Summit, and look forward to seeing you in the next one.